Josie Calloway had gotten the angle exactly right by the fourth night. Nose of the sedan tucked behind the overgrown hedge at the edge of the gravel turnout, just far enough off the estate's main drive that the perimeter cameras mounted on the stone pillars wouldn't catch her plates, close enough to the tree line that headlights from the road wouldn't sweep across the windshield while she slept. She'd learned the geometry of hiding the way she'd learned everything useful in her life lately. Alone by trial and error with nobody to ask. 11 nights now. She counted them the way she counted everything else. The miles left on a quarter tank, the hours until her shift at the diner 2 towns over, the exact temperature at which the car stopped being tolerable and started being dangerous. Tonight the readout on the dash said 41 degrees, and she had her father's old flannel pulled over her knees, not worn, just laid there, folded the way he used to fold it over the back of a kitchen chair after a long day outside. She hadn't put it on. Somewhere in the 11 nights she'd decided that if she started wearing it to survive the cold, it would stop being his and start being hers. A scrap of practical wool instead of the last thing that still smelled faintly like cut grass and engine oil, and a man who'd spent 20 years keeping other people's land beautiful while his own daughter slept in a car on the edge of it. Her father had worked groundskeeping for the Moretti estate for 2 decades. Josie had grown up half a mile from where she now parked, in the small caretaker's house that came with the job, watching him leave before dawn and come home after dark with dirt under his nails and a tiredness that never once turned into complaint. When he got sick 8 months ago, she'd left the tail end of nursing school to take care of him, a decision her mother's side of the family had never let her forget, framing it not as devotion but as one more example of Josie choosing the easy, unambitious path, the same way they framed her weight, her quietness, everything about her that didn't match the sharper, thinner cousins who'd gone on to actual careers and actual lives. He died 6 months ago. The paperwork terminating his groundskeeper position had arrived 4 weeks after the funeral, brisk and impersonal, informing her that the position was no longer active and that the housing arrangement tied to it was terminated effective immediately. No severance. No transition assistance. A signature at the bottom she hadn't looked closely at, too exhausted by grief to notice what she'd later understand she should have. She had nowhere else to go and too much pride left to call the relatives who'd make it a referendum on every choice she'd ever made instead of the emergency it actually was. So she'd found the turnout and the hedge and the gas station 4 miles down the road where she washed up before her diner shift, careful and quick, telling the night manager nothing when he glanced at her a beat too long. She told no one. Telling someone made it real in a way that simply enduring it somehow didn't. Tonight, headlights swept the gravel. Not from the road, from inside the property, moving slow along the perimeter path. Josie went still, the old instinct kicking in before conscious thought caught up, and watched a young man in a security jacket bring his flashlight to a stop 3 feet from her back bumper. He didn't approach the window. He stood there a moment, the beam steady on her plates, and then he turned and walked back toward the main house without knocking, without announcing himself, leaving her alone in the dark with her pulse loud in her ears and the certainty finally that 11 nights of careful hiding had run out. She didn't know his name yet. Teo, the guard, would introduce himself as 3 days from now in a conversation she wouldn't be present for, the one where he stood in a lit hallway with his hands loose at his sides, uncertain whether what he was about to say was worth interrupting his boss for, and said it anyway, quiet and careful, the way you say something you suspect matters more than you've been trained to notice. Sir, the fat girl has been sleeping in the car. Inside the main house, a man set down his phone mid-call, and the direction of everything Josie thought she understood about her life quietly, permanently began to change. Vincent Moretti didn't ask Teo to repeat himself. He simply set the phone face down on the desk, the unfinished call abandoned without ceremony, and looked at the young guard with the particular stillness that made people in his orbit choose their next words carefully. 3rd night. 3rd that I've seen. Could be longer. Teo shifted his weight, the discomfort of a man delivering information he wasn't sure his boss wanted. I almost logged it as a trespass. Something about it didn't sit right, so I figured I'd bring it to you first. Good instinct. Vincent stood, reaching for his coat. Show me. The walk to the turnout took 4 minutes in the cold, long enough for Vincent to run through the obvious possibilities and discard most of them. A squatter, a runaway, someone chasing the property for a larger crew. None of it matched what Teo had actually reported, the specificity of 3rd night, the care in which I almost logged it. Whoever this was, Teo had decided on instinct, that the situation deserved a closer look before it became a report with consequences attached. Josie's car came into view behind the hedge, engine off, condensation fogging the inside of the windows. Vincent approached from the front deliberately, so she'd see him coming rather than startle at a shape appearing beside her door in the dark. She rolled the window down 2 inches when he knocked, the same wary economy of motion she'd use again days later with someone else entirely, though neither of them knew that yet. Her eyes, when they found him in the weak spill of his flashlight, held no surprise. Just the flat exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment and had run out of energy to dread it properly. "I'll move," she said before he'd asked anything. "Tonight. I know this is private property. I didn't come out here to move you along." Vincent's voice carried none of the impatience she'd braced for. "I came to find out why a man's daughter is sleeping in a car on land where her father worked for 20 years. Something in Josie's face shifted. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of wary recalibration, the sense of a script she'd rehearsed for a very different confrontation suddenly not fitting the scene in front of her. "You knew my father? Everyone who's worked at this property for more than a decade, I know." He said it plainly, not as a boast. "Frank Calloway, groundskeeper. Started the same year I took over from my father." He watched the name land on her, watched her exhale slightly, as though hearing her father's full name spoken by someone who remembered it correctly was its own small mercy after months of paperwork that had reduced him to a case number. What happened to the housing arrangement that came with his position? "Terminated. Along with his job after he died. I got a letter." Josie's jaw tightened, old shame rising fast and automatic. "There's no severance clause for daughters apparently. I didn't ask for a handout. I just needed time to figure out where to go, and every place I figured out fell through." "There's a severance clause," Vincent said. "I wrote it myself into every employment contract on this property, specifically for situations exactly like this one. Whoever processed that termination either didn't know that or decided it didn't apply to you." He paused, watching the information register on her face. Confusion first, then something sharper, the particular alertness of someone realizing a wrong she'd absorbed as simple bad luck might actually have a cause with a name attached to it. "That's not a small discrepancy. I intend to find out where it came from. You don't need to fix this for me." The deflection came fast, reflexive, the same instinct that had kept her quiet for 11 nights instead of asking anyone for help. "I'll figure something out. I always do. You've been figuring it out in a parking spot behind a hedge for 11 nights. Vincent's tone didn't soften into pity, which was, Josie would realize later, exactly why she didn't flinch from it the way she flinched from kindness that expected gratitude in return. "That's not you figuring it out. That's you surviving an administrative failure that should never have happened on my property. There's a difference, and I'd like you to let me correct the second thing instead of asking you to keep managing on your own." She sat with that for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, and Vincent recognized the particular calculation happening behind her eyes. Not whether to trust him, not yet, but whether accepting help from him would cost her something she wasn't prepared to pay. "The guest cottage on the east side of the property is empty," he said before she could refuse outright. "It has heat, a working kitchen, and a lock you control. I'm not offering you charity. I'm correcting a mistake my estate manager made when he processed your father's termination without my sign-off. Consider it back pay on an error, not a gift." The distinction mattered to her. He could see it land and take hold. Something she could accept without owing the debt of gratitude she clearly didn't trust yet. She nodded once, sharp and small, and reached for the flannel folded on the passenger seat before she opened her door, carrying it the way you carry something too important to leave behind even for one night. "I'm not signing anything that puts me back on this property's payroll," she said, following him toward the lit windows of the main house. "I don't want to be a project." "You're not a project," Vincent said. "You're an unresolved discrepancy in my books. I intend to resolve it properly starting tonight." She didn't answer that, but she didn't argue either, and the walk back to the house passed in a silence that felt, for the first time in 11 nights, less like hiding and more like the beginning of being seen. The guest cottage held heat better than the car ever had, and Josie woke the first morning disoriented by the simple fact of having slept flat, warm, and undisturbed for 6 consecutive hours. A luxury that took a moment to recognize as real rather than something she'd wake from back behind the hedge. Vincent found her in the small kitchen an hour later, going through her father's old employment folder he'd had pulled from the estate's records room, a request she hadn't made but hadn't stopped either, curious despite herself about what the paperwork actually said. This is his signature. She held up a page, frowning, comparing it against a photograph taped inside the folder's cover. Her father at the estate's holiday party 3 years back, an old habit of his employers to keep informal records alongside formal ones. That's not it. Vincent crossed the kitchen and took the page, studying the resignation letter dated 2 weeks before her father's death, the looping signature at the bottom that claimed to be Frank Calloway's own hand relinquishing his position voluntarily. You're certain? I watched that man sign birthday cards for 30 years. This isn't his handwriting. Josie's voice had lost the flat exhaustion of the parking lot, replaced now by something sharper, more focused. The particular clarity of someone finally allowed to be angry about something specific instead of generally, diffusely wrong. He was too sick to hold a pen steady by that point anyway. He couldn't have signed anything, let alone something this legible. Vincent set the page down carefully, the way you set down evidence you intend to use. Harlan Voss processed this termination. He's run the estate's household accounts for 6 years. Vendor payments, staff payroll, contractor agreements. I don't sign off on every document that crosses his desk. I trusted him to bring me anything that needed my attention. He didn't bring you this. No. The single word carried weight, a recalculation happening in real time. Which means either he made an error significant enough to bury, or he made a decision he knew I wouldn't have approved and forged the paperwork to avoid the conversation entirely. Josie watched him work through it, recognizing something in his methodical stillness that matched her own instinct for numbers. The particular satisfaction of a person who trusted evidence over assumption. The stipend that came with the housing arrangement, she said slowly. It stopped the same month the termination letter arrived. Where did it go if not to severance? That's the question I intend to answer today. Vincent gathered the folder's contents, aligning the pages with the same care Josie used organizing her own scattered paperwork, a small mirrored gesture neither of them commented on. I'd like you to stay while I pull the full accounts. You know your father's history here better than anyone on my staff. If something looks wrong you'll see it before I do. It wasn't an invitation extended out of kindness, and Josie recognized that distinction immediately, the same distinction that had let her accept the cottage the night before. He needed her specific knowledge, not her gratitude, and that made the offer easier to accept than any comfort would have been. They worked through the afternoon in the estate's small business office, Vincent pulling account records while Josie cross-referenced dates against her own memory of her father's final months. The hospital bills that had piled up, the housing stipend that had simply stopped arriving 3 weeks before his actual death, weeks before any termination letter should have legally applied even under the falsified resignation's own timeline. He forged it retroactively, Josie said, staring at the dates laid side by side. The stipend stopped before the letter's date. Whoever did this needed the paperwork to catch up with a decision he'd already made. Harlan Voss, Vincent said, and something in his voice had gone quiet in a way that Josie recognized, without yet fully understanding, as more dangerous than shouting would have been. He's been diverting funds for at least 3 weeks before your father died, and manufacturing consent after the fact to cover it. That's not an accounting error. That's theft built carefully enough to survive a cursory glance. Where did the money go? Vincent pulled up a secondary account, cross-referenced against the estate's outgoing transfers, and the pattern that emerged made his jaw tighten in a way Josie hadn't seen from him yet. An account I don't recognize. Not connected to any vendor or contractor I've approved. He looked up at her, and something in his expression carried the particular seriousness of a man realizing a problem was larger than the single injustice that had brought it to his attention. I need to know if this is isolated to your father's case or if it's a pattern. Given how carefully it was covered, I doubt it's the first time. Josie felt the ground of her understanding shift again, the particular vertigo of watching a private grief reveal itself as one piece of something far larger and more calculated. You think there are others? I think, Vincent said, closing the folder with deliberate care, that I need to have a very different conversation with Harlan Voss than the one I was planning to have tomorrow, and that you should be in the room when I have it. The audit took 3 days to compile properly, and by the time Vincent laid the full documentation across his desk, The shape of what Harlan Voss had built over 2 years had gone from suspicion to undeniable fact. Josie sat across from him in the same chair she'd occupied during their first working session, watching him turn page after page with the particular patience of a man who wanted every detail confirmed before he acted on it. "It's not just my father," she said, though she'd already suspected it. "The pattern in the account transfers is too consistent to be a single opportunistic decision. 6 former employees. All terminated within the last 2 years. All with housing or severance arrangements quietly reduced or eliminated entirely under paperwork Voss processed without my sign-off." Vincent's voice carried the flat precision of a man cataloging damage rather than expressing outrage, though something colder moved beneath the surface of it. 2 of them elderly. 1 a widow raising 3 children alone. He built a system, Josie. Your father wasn't a mistake he made once. He was one entry in a pattern Voss had already perfected. The word landed on her with unexpected force, not because the theft itself surprised her anymore, but because hearing it named plainly, pattern, system, confirmed something she'd suspected without letting herself fully believe, that her father's final months hadn't been failed by simple bureaucratic carelessness. They'd been failed by someone who'd calculated deliberately that a dying man's daughter would be too exhausted by grief to look closely at the paperwork burying his own theft. "He counted on people not checking," she said quietly. "He counted on grief making people compliant. He counted on nobody with authority ever looking closely enough to compare a signature against a photograph from a holiday party." Vincent met her eyes, and something in his expression carried an acknowledgement she hadn't expected. Not pity, but genuine respect for the specific unglamorous work that had cracked the pattern open. "You're the reason I have this. Not the audit. You noticed the signature before I ran a single number." Josie didn't know what to do with the observation, and used to her attention to detail being framed as valuable rather than merely obsessive, a trait her relatives had always folded into the general catalog of things wrong with her. Too careful, too quiet, too unwilling to let things simply go unquestioned. "What happens now?" she asked, though some part of her already understood that whatever answer Vincent gave would change the shape of the next several weeks entirely. "Now I confront him with everything, and I make sure he understands there's no version of this where he keeps his position, his freedom, or the money he's already diverted." Vincent closed the folder, the gesture carrying finality. "But I need you to understand something before I do that. Once I move on this, he'll know exactly who brought it to my attention. He's not a stupid man. He'll know it traces back to you. You're asking if I'm willing to be the reason he loses everything. I'm asking if you're prepared for him to fight back before he loses it," Vincent said. "Men like Voss don't go quietly when they're cornered. He'll look for leverage. The easiest leverage available to him will be you, a woman with no formal standing on this property, no employment contract, nothing protecting her position here except my word." Josie felt the old instinct rise, the reflexive impulse to make herself smaller, to withdraw before the situation could cost her more than she was prepared to lose. She'd spent 11 nights hiding behind a hedge specifically to avoid exactly this kind of exposure, the vulnerability of being visible enough to become a target. But underneath the old instinct, something newer and sharper had begun to take root over the past 3 days. The specific unfamiliar experience of her carefulness being treated as an asset instead of a flaw, her father's memory being defended rather than quietly erased from a ledger nobody thought worth double-checking. "I'm not hiding from this," she said, and the decision, once spoken aloud, settled into something firm and unshakable in her chest. "He forged my father's signature while he was dying. I want to be in the room when you tell him you know that." Vincent studied her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting into what she'd later recognize as the particular respect he reserved for people who made difficult decisions without flinching from the cost. "Then we do this together," he said. "But understand, once this starts, there's no version where it stays contained to a quiet conversation. He'll escalate. I need you ready for that." "I've been ready longer than you know," Josie said, echoing without realizing it a sentiment that would prove true across every difficult turn still ahead of them. Harlan Voss did not go quietly, and his first move, when it came 2 days later, was calculated with the precision of a man who'd spent years learning exactly which levers moved which outcomes on this property. Josie was in the guest cottage kitchen when the estate's head of security appeared at her door, uncomfortable in a way that told her immediately something had shifted since the confrontation Vincent had scheduled for that afternoon. Mr. Voss has filed a formal complaint, the man said, not quite meeting her eyes. Trespassing. He's citing your presence on the property without an employment contract or guest authorization documented in the official visitor log. Mr. Moretti invited me here himself. I know. But the visitor log requires his personal countersignature within 48 hours of any extended stay, and that paperwork wasn't filed. The security head's discomfort deepened, the particular unease of a man caught between two authorities he wasn't sure how to navigate. Mr. Voss is citing the oversight. He's requesting your removal from the property pending review. It was, Josie understood immediately, a technicality weaponized with surgical precision. Not a lie exactly, simply a bureaucratic gap Voss had identified and exploited before Vincent's own paperwork could catch up to the informal arrangement of the past week. The particular cruelty of it, targeting the exact kind of procedural loophole that had already cost her father his housing once, wasn't lost on her. She found Vincent in his office 20 minutes later, his expression already set into something hard and controlled. The folder of evidence from the audit spread across his desk alongside a fresh complaint bearing Voss's signature. He's betting my attention won't hold, Vincent said without preamble, watching her absorb the situation. He's betting that if he creates enough procedural noise, I'll get distracted managing the technicality instead of pursuing the actual theft. It's a reasonable bet, based on how most people in my position would handle competing crises. Is he wrong? He's about to find out exactly how wrong. Vincent's voice carried none of the panic the situation seemed designed to provoke. I'm countersigning your visitor authorization right now, backdated to the night I brought you here, which is entirely within my authority as owner of this property. That closes his technicality in under 5 minutes. He signed the document with a single decisive stroke, sliding it across the desk toward the security head, who'd followed Josie into the room and now looked relieved to have somewhere to direct the paperwork. File that immediately. Then pull every account Voss has touched in the last 3 years, not just the 6 terminations we've already confirmed. If he's desperate enough to attack a paperwork gap this fast, he's desperate about something larger than what we've already found. The instruction proved prescient within hours. The expanded audit, compiled overnight by Vincent's small team of trusted staff, surfaced not 6 diversions but 11. A pattern stretching back nearly 3 years, touching former employees, current contractors, even a small skimming operation on the estate's landscaping budget that had nothing to do with terminations at all. Simply opportunistic theft compounding quietly in the margins of accounts nobody had thought to scrutinize closely. He's been doing this the entire time he's worked for you, Josie said, staring at the scope of it laid out across Vincent's desk the following morning, the particular vertigo of watching a private grief reveal itself as merely the smallest visible fragment of something far larger. My father was one name on a list he'd already built a system around. Which means this stopped being a personal matter for me the moment I saw the full scope of it. Vincent's jaw was tight, controlled fury beneath careful precision. This isn't just correcting what happened to you anymore. It's protecting every family whose stability he's quietly stolen out from under them while I trusted him to manage this estate honestly. The confrontation, when Voss finally arrived at the main house that afternoon, summoned by a message that gave him no indication of what awaited him, began with the particular arrogance of a man still convinced he could talk his way through anything. This is a misunderstanding, he said before Vincent had even gestured him toward a chair. The Callaway situation, the visitor log complaint. I was simply following the procedures I've always followed. If there's confusion about the specifics. 11 accounts, Vincent said, sliding the full audit across the desk without a preamble. 3 years of diversions. A forged resignation from a dying man whose daughter you tried to have removed from this property on a technicality you manufactured out of desperation. There's no confusion here, Harlan. There's only the question of how much of this you intend to admit before I involve the authorities. Voss's composure, so carefully maintained through years of quiet theft, finally visibly cracked, the color draining from his face as he registered the full weight of documentation arrayed against him, and understood in that moment that whatever leverage he'd hoped to hold over Vincent's attention had already entirely run out. You don't understand what it's like, Voss said, his voice dropping into something closer to genuine desperation than the practiced composure he'd walked in with. Managing accounts for a family this size, Watching money move through this house that most of these employees will never see a fraction of in their entire lives. Frank Calloway's severance was a rounding error to this estate. It wasn't a rounding error to me. So you decided it was yours to take, Vincent said, his voice carrying none of the heat Voss's did, which made the words land with more finality. A man spent 20 years maintaining this property, and while he was dying, you decided his final weeks of security belonged to you more than to his daughter. I was going to pay it back. For 3 years. Josie's voice cut in, steady despite the tremor she felt beneath it, the same steadiness she'd found once before at a kitchen table 3 days earlier when she'd first recognized her father's signature had been stolen alongside his money. You forged his handwriting while he was too sick to hold a pen. You had the paperwork ready before he'd even died. That's not a temporary loan you meant to correct. That's a plan you executed with precision. Voss's eyes moved to her, some old reflex searching for the weaker party in the room, the one he might still be able to redirect blame toward. You're the one who came onto this property uninvited and started digging through records that were never yours to access. She noticed a signature that didn't match a photograph, Vincent said, cutting off the deflection before it could gain any traction. That's the entire extent of her wrongdoing, Harlan. Everything after that has been my audit, my documentation, my decision to pursue this fully. If you're looking for someone to blame for your exposure, look at the 11 accounts on that desk. They did the talking. She just noticed that everyone else was too careless to check. The room held a silence that carried weight, Voss's last remaining strategy, deflecting blame onto Josie's presence rather than his own theft, visibly failing to find any purchase in the face of documentation too thorough to argue against. What happens to me now? Voss said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of the composure he'd arrived with, reduced now to something smaller, more exposed. You're terminated, effective immediately without severance, given the circumstances. Vincent's voice carried no satisfaction in the statement, only the flat finality of a decision already made and simply being announced. The diverted funds will be recovered through legal channels, and I intend to press charges for fraud and forgery, given the specific circumstances of the Calloway case. You have 1 hour to remove your personal belongings from this property before security escorts you out. Voss opened his mouth to argue further, some last reflex reaching for a negotiation that no longer existed and found apparently nothing left to say. He stood, the folder of evidence still spread across the desk between them, and left the office without another word, the particular silence of his exit carrying more finality than any argument could have. Josie sat very still after the door closed, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a confrontation she dreaded actually resolving in her favor, the fear that had accompanied her into this room slowly loosening into something closer to relief. He's really finished, she said half to herself, testing whether the sentence felt true when spoken aloud. He's finished. Vincent gathered the audit documents, aligning them with the same careful precision he brought to every task, though something in his posture had eased now that the confrontation had passed. What remains is correcting what he took. Your father's severance, the housing stipend he was owed until his death, and the back payments on both that should have arrived months ago. He looked up at her, and something in his expression carried a question he hadn't yet asked outright. I also intend to offer you something beyond simple restitution, once the immediate correction is finalized. I want you to think about it before you answer, rather than deciding out of gratitude for what's already been fixed. What kind of offer? The kind we should discuss properly, Vincent said, once you've had a night to simply feel the relief of this being over, rather than immediately calculating what comes next. You've spent 11 nights unable to rest. Let yourself have tonight before I ask you to make another decision. The formal resolution, when it came the following week, unfolded not as spectacle but as the quiet, methodical correction Vincent had promised from the first night he'd walked out to the turnout. Restitution processed, legal counsel engaged to pursue charges against Voss. The 11 affected families contacted individually and informed of the diversions uncovered on their behalf. Josie sat in Vincent's office as he finalized the last of her father's paperwork, watching him work through the specific unglamorous mechanics of correcting a wrong that had nearly gone unnoticed entirely. Full severance, backdated to the date it should have originally been paid, plus interest, he said, sliding the finalized document across the desk toward her. The housing stipend continues retroactively through the date of your father's death, as the original contract specified, rather than the falsified termination date Voss manufactured. And a formal written acknowledgement from this estate that the initial handling of his passing constituted a significant institutional failure. Josie read through the figures slowly, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the letter arrived 4 weeks after the funeral. Not triumph exactly, but the particular relief of watching a wrong finally, fully named and corrected rather than simply absorbed and carried forward silently. "This is more than I expected," she said. "It's what was owed. Nothing more." Vincent's voice carried the same flat precision it always did when discussing numbers, though something warmer moved beneath it now, less guarded than the transactional exchanges of their first days working together. "I also want to address the second matter, now that the correction is complete. The offer. The estate's household accounts have been managed poorly for years, evidently, given how long Voss's diversions went unnoticed." Vincent leaned forward slightly, his attention direct in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular form of respect. "I need someone managing them who checks a signature against a photograph without being asked to. Someone who notices discrepancies other people are too careless or too complicit to flag. You've proven you're that person twice now without formal training, simply because you refuse to let something feel wrong without investigating why. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you authority over exactly the kind of oversight that would have caught Voss years before he touched your father's case at all." Vincent's directness carried no pressure, simply the plain statement of an offer he intended her to consider fully rather than accept out of obligation. Full salary, benefits, a formal contract with every clause reviewed by counsel this time, not left to a single unsupervised employee's discretion. "You'd answer to me on major decisions, but the daily oversight would be entirely yours." Josie felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to deflect, to insist she didn't need this, the same instinct that had kept her hiding behind a hedge for 11 nights rather than asking anyone for help. But underneath the reflex, something newer had taken hold over the past 2 weeks, the specific unfamiliar experience of her carefulness being treated as valuable rather than merely a quirk to be tolerated. "I want to negotiate the terms myself," she said finally. "Not accept whatever you draft because I'm grateful for the cottage and the severance. If I'm managing accounts for this estate, I want the same authority any qualified accountant would have, and I want it in writing before I sign anything." Something in Vincent's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine approval he didn't bother hiding. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for," he said. "I don't want someone who accepts terms out of gratitude. I want someone who negotiates with them because she knows her own worth. Draft your terms. I'll review them with counsel and we'll finalize something fair to both of us." It wasn't romance, not yet, not in any way either of them named directly in that office. It was something steadier building underneath the professional exchange, the particular respect of two people who'd both learned the hard way, not to trust easy kindness, recognizing in each other someone who offered something more durable instead. The external conflict, the theft, the forged signature, the technicality Voss had weaponized in his last desperate attempt to protect himself, had resolved itself the way conflicts were resolved when someone with real authority finally checked the numbers instead of accepting the story built to hide them. What remained wasn't a question of justice anymore. It was only the quieter question of what Josie wanted to build, now that she'd finally stopped merely surviving long enough to be asked. 3 months later, Josie stood in the guest cottage's small bedroom, no longer temporary now that Vincent had formalized her tenancy alongside her employment contract, holding her father's flannel in both hands and looking at the closet she'd had installed the week she signed her final terms. A real closet with a door that closed properly, shelving built specifically because she'd mentioned once in passing that she'd never had enough space to keep things that mattered without them getting crushed or forgotten. She hung the flannel on its own hook, not folded away in a drawer the way it had sat on the passenger seat for 11 nights, not treated as something too precious to actually use. She reached for it that evening sometimes now when the cottage got cold, wearing it the way her father once had, not as a relic to preserve, but as something alive enough to keep serving its purpose. The household accounts under her management had already surfaced 2 smaller discrepancies in the months since Voss's termination. Nothing on the scale of what he'd built, but enough to confirm quietly that her attention to detail wasn't a fluke born of one specific grief. It was simply who she was finally given the authority to matter. Vincent found her in the small home office he'd had set up for her adjacent to the main house, reviewing the quarters figures with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him, watching her work with an expression he no longer bothered disguising as purely professional interest. "The Hendricks family called," he said when she finally looked up. "The widow whose severance Voss diverted 2 years ago. She wanted to thank you personally for flagging the pattern that led to her restitution." "I didn't do that for thanks." "I know." Vincent crossed the small office, settling into the chair across from her desk, the same easy familiarity that had built itself gradually between them over months of quarterly reviews and quiet trust. "That's exactly why it matters more coming from you. You didn't do any of this to be recognized. You did it because it was true and because nobody else had bothered to look." Josie set down her pen, feeling the particular unfamiliar warmth of being understood by someone who'd never once needed her to perform gratitude or smallness, or the careful invisibility she'd spent years perfecting for a family who'd never valued her the way this one unexpectedly had. "I keep thinking about how close I came to just moving the car again," she said quietly. "Finding another turnout, another hedge, staying hidden instead of letting Teo's report reach you. If he hadn't said something..." "He said something because you'd already stopped being invisible before I ever walked out to that turnout," Vincent said. "He noticed you 3 nights running and chose to bring it to me instead of filing a trespass report. That wasn't luck. That was someone recognizing there was more to your situation than what it looked like on the surface, and caring enough to find out." Outside the office window, the estate's grounds stretched toward the tree line where the turnout still sat, mostly forgotten now except by Josie herself, who passed it sometimes on her way into town and felt each time a small private acknowledgement of the distance she'd traveled from those 11 nights of careful hiding. She thought sometimes about the version of this story where Teo had simply filed the trespass report, where she'd moved the car before anyone noticed, where the theft against her father's memory had gone uncorrected alongside 11 other quiet injustices nobody with authority had ever bothered to check. That version had been the only one she'd expected, right up until someone had finally, deliberately, chosen to look closer. She didn't know yet exactly what came next between her and Vincent, whether the warmth building steadily beneath their professional partnership would deepen into something neither of them had named aloud, or whether it would simply remain the particular, durable respect that had carried them both this far already. But she knew, standing in an office with her own authority finally recognized, her father's memory finally honored instead of quietly erased, that she was no longer the woman who hid behind hedges hoping nobody would notice her need. She was the one people came to now when something didn't add up and trusted to find out why. If someone had walked past your hardest night without stopping, would you have kept hiding or would you have let yourself finally be seen? Thank you for reading. If Josie's story stayed with you, there are more waiting.